What if the next war has already begun? Elder Ephraim of Arizona saw what governments cannot detect, an unseen war consuming humanity from within. Not missiles, not armies, but something far more dangerous, a collapse starting in human hearts that would cascade into global devastation. His prophecy speaks of moral disintegration, the rise of a new power, and specific signs marking the approach of the final conflict. The war you cannot see is the one that will destroy everything you know. The monastery sat like a forgotten witness against the Arizona landscape, its weathered stones holding secrets that most visitors never comprehended during their brief pilgrimages, seeking blessings or guidance from the elder who resided within those walls. Elder Ephraim moved through those corridors with the slow deliberation of someone who saw beyond the immediate present, his eyes carrying the weight of visions that had visited him in prayer and fasting, revelations that he shared sparingly and only when the spiritual atmosphere demanded such disclosure. Those who knew him understood that his words were never casual predictions or comfortable reassurances, but rather surgical incisions into the fabric of time itself, revealing tumors of spiritual decay that were growing beneath the surface of what appeared to be normal civilization. The desert around the monastery seemed to amplify this quality, as if the barren landscape itself was a reflection of what he perceived in the collective soul of humanity. Stripped of pretense, exposed to elements that test everything, revealing what remains when all superficial comfort has been burned away by relentless sun and unforgiving truth. The concept of the unseen war emerged from his teachings not as metaphor, but as concrete spiritual reality, a dimension of conflict that existed prior to and independent of any physical manifestation, that human observers might eventually recognize as traditional warfare or political upheaval. He described this war as beginning in the internal landscape of individual human hearts, where choices between truth and deception, love and hatred, humility and pride were being made every moment of every day, each decision contributing to a larger spiritual architecture that was either building toward collective redemption or collective catastrophe. The elder emphasized repeatedly that this internal battlefield was not abstract or symbolic, but the primary theater of authentic warfare, with consequences that would eventually cascade outward into social structures, political systems, and international relations in ways that would appear to secular observers as sudden eruptions of chaos, but were actually the inevitable external manifestations of long gestating spiritual diseases. His insistence on this sequence, internal first, external second, challenged the conventional understanding that wars begin with political grievances or economic pressures, suggesting instead that such visible triggers were merely symptoms of deeper spiritual corruption that had already reached critical mass in the hidden dimensions of human consciousness. Those who documented his words noted the precision with which he described the collapse of moral order as the foundational precondition for the physical conflict he foresaw, not as general ethical decline, but as specific erosions in particular areas of human conduct and belief that would create vacuum conditions into which destructive forces would inevitably rush. He spoke of the abandonment of objective truth as the first critical failure, describing how societies would reach a point where truth itself became negotiable, subject to political convenience or emotional preference, rather than recognized as an absolute standard against which all human action must be measured and judged. This dissolution of truth as a fixed reference point would, according to his vision, create conditions where manipulation and deception could operate without constraint, where leaders could justify any action through rhetorical flexibility, and where populations could be led into catastrophic decisions because they had lost the ability to distinguish between authentic reality and manufactured narrative. The elder's warnings on this point were particularly emphatic, suggesting that the loss of truth was not merely one problem among many, but the foundational crack that would allow all other structures of civilization to crumble and collapse. Beyond the collapse of truth, Elder Ephraim identified the disintegration of family structures and the perversion of natural human relationships as the second pillar of spiritual decay that would prepare the ground for the unseen war's physical manifestation. He described how the fundamental bonds between parents and children, husbands and wives, would be systematically weakened through ideological assault and cultural redefinition, leaving individuals isolated and vulnerable in ways that previous generations had never experienced, despite enduring far greater material hardships and physical dangers. This isolation, he suggested, was not accidental but strategic, a spiritual strategy designed to separate humans from the natural sources of strength, wisdom, and resilience that families had traditionally provided, leaving them dependent on external systems and authorities that could more easily manipulate and control populations, lacking the internal fortifications that strong familial bonds naturally create. The elders' vision on this point included specific observations about how children would be turned against parents through educational systems, how marriages would be undermined through cultural messages promoting self-gratification over sacrificial commitment, and how the very concept of permanent bonds would be replaced by fluid arrangements that dissolved when they became inconvenient or emotionally challenging. The rise of what Elder Ephraim called the new global power represented the third major element in his prophetic warnings, though he was characteristically cautious about identifying this power through conventional geopolitical categories or specific national identities that might satisfy listeners seeking simple, predictive clarity. Instead, he described this emerging force through its spiritual characteristics and operational methods, suggesting it would be recognized not primarily through military strength or economic dominance, but through its capacity to reshape human consciousness itself, to redefine fundamental categories of thought and belief in ways that would make resistance to its agenda seem not just difficult, but literally inconceivable to those who had been successfully conditioned by its pervasive influence. This power, according to his vision, would operate through systems that appeared beneficial and progressive on the surface, promising peace, prosperity, unity, and solutions to persistent human problems, while simultaneously requiring the surrender of internal freedom and authentic spiritual identity as the price of participation in the new order it was constructing. The elder emphasized that this power's most dangerous quality would be its ability to present spiritual bondage as liberation, to make slavery appear as enlightenment, and to convince populations that their willing submission represented the height of human advancement rather than the depth of human degradation. Throughout his teachings on these matters, Elder Ephraim consistently returned to the theme of specific signs that would mark the progression toward the final devastating conflict he foresaw. Indicators that careful observers could recognize if they maintained spiritual vigilance and refused the cultural anesthesia that would be constantly offered through entertainment, distraction, and the overwhelming flood of trivial information designed to prevent contemplation and genuine understanding. He spoke of natural disruptions that would increase in frequency and intensity, not as random environmental events, but as physical responses to spiritual conditions, as if creation itself was reacting to the accumulation of human choices that violated the fundamental order within which life was meant to flourish and thrive. He mentioned the acceleration of time itself, a subjective experience that many would notice, where years seemed to pass like months like weeks, not as mere psychological perception, but as an actual alteration in the quality of temporal experience that would occur as history approached its critical thresholds. These signs, he insisted, were meant not to induce paralysis through fear, but to awaken those capable of awakening, to provide opportunity for preparation and spiritual fortification before the external manifestations of the unseen war became unavoidable and overwhelming to those who had ignored all previous warnings and refused all opportunities for genuine repentance and transformation. The moral order whose collapse Elder Ephraim predicted with such certainty was not, in his understanding, a human construction subject to arbitrary revision according to changing preferences or evolving cultural sensibilities, but rather a reflection of fundamental spiritual laws as fixed and immutable as the physical laws governing gravity or thermodynamics. Laws that could be violated but never actually repealed, with violations producing inevitable consequences, regardless of whether those consequences were immediately visible or culturally acknowledged. He described this order as woven into the fabric of reality itself, a divine architecture within which human life was meant to operate, and through which human flourishing became possible when the design was honored, and catastrophe became inevitable when the design was rejected or ignored. The elders' teaching on this point challenge the modern assumption that morality is primarily about social convention or utilitarian calculation, suggesting instead that moral law represents objective truth about the nature of reality, truth that precedes and supersedes human opinion or democratic consensus, truth that remains valid and operative even when entire civilizations choose to deny or defy it. The specific mechanisms through which this moral order would collapse formed a detailed map in Elder Ephraim's prophetic vision, beginning with the corruption of language itself as the primary weapon through which truth would be systematically obscured and eventually rendered inaccessible to populations trained to accept linguistic manipulation as normal discourse. He observed how words would be gradually emptied of their traditional meanings and refilled with new content that served ideological purposes rather than descriptive accuracy, how terms would be weaponized to shut down discussion rather than facilitate understanding, and how entire categories of thought would be declared illegitimate through the simple expedient of labeling them with words that had been preloaded with negative associations designed to trigger emotional rejection rather than rational evaluation. This corruption of language represented, in his view, a direct assault on the human capacity for truth itself, because language is the primary medium through which humans think and communicate about reality. And when that medium becomes compromised, the ability to recognize and respond to truth becomes correspondingly damaged or destroyed. The elder specifically warned about the rise of speech codes and the policing of expression, not as minor restrictions on freedom, but as foundational attacks on the human capacity to resist deception and manipulation. Economic systems would play a crucial role in the architecture of collapse that Elder Ephraim described, not through the traditional prophetic imagery of mark and beast scenarios that captured popular imagination, but through subtler mechanisms of dependency and control that would make resistance to the emerging global power practically impossible for those who relied entirely on conventional systems for their survival and sustenance. He spoke of the gradual elimination of economic independence, the systematic destruction of small-scale production and local economies, in favor of centralized systems that could monitor and regulate every transaction, every exchange, every movement of resources, from producer to consumer. This consolidation, he suggested, was not primarily motivated by efficiency or legitimate economic optimization, but by the strategic goal of creating populations that could be controlled through economic pressure, where dissent could be punished through exclusion from the means of survival without any need for direct physical persecution or obvious tyranny. The elders' warnings on this dimension were particularly sobering because they described a form of totalitarian control that would be experienced not as oppression, but as convenience, not as slavery, but as seamless integration into modern life, making resistance appear not heroic, but simply foolish and unnecessary to those who had been successfully domesticated by comfort and dependency. The role of technology in facilitating the collapse occupied significant attention in Elder Ephraim's teachings, though he approached this subject with the nuanced understanding of someone who recognized that tools themselves are morally neutral, while their systematic application toward particular ends carries profound spiritual implications and dangers. He described the emergence of surveillance systems that would make privacy functionally obsolete, not through sudden imposition, but through gradual normalization, as populations were trained to surrender personal information and accept monitoring in exchange for minor conveniences, or under the rationale of safety and security from various real or manufactured threats. This surveillance architecture, according to his vision, would eventually extend beyond mere observation into direct modification of behavior and thought, as technologies would be developed and deployed that could influence human consciousness itself, manipulating emotions, shaping perceptions, and directing choices in ways that individuals would not recognize as external manipulation, because the technologies would operate beneath the threshold of conscious awareness. The elders' concern was not with technology per se, but with the spiritual condition of humanity that would make such comprehensive control possible and acceptable the internal emptiness and loss of spiritual identity that would leave people without the internal resources necessary to recognize and resist the technological colonization of their own minds and souls. Educational systems represented another critical vector in the collapse Elder Ephraim foresaw, institutions that would be systematically converted from centers of genuine learning and cultivation of wisdom into factories for producing compliant citizens whose minds had been carefully formatted to accept official narratives and reject traditional sources of truth and moral guidance. He described how this transformation would occur not primarily through overt indoctrination, though that would certainly be present, but through the more subtle process of controlling what questions could be asked, what sources could be consulted, what conclusions could be drawn without triggering social and institutional punishment. The elder specifically warned about the separation of children from parental influence during their most formative years, not merely through the practical reality of institutional schooling, but through the ideological content of that schooling, which would explicitly teach children to view their parents' beliefs and values as outdated obstacles to enlightenment, rather than as wisdom accumulated through generations of lived experience. This separation, he insisted, was strategically designed to break the transmission of traditional knowledge and spiritual understanding from generation to generation, creating populations that had been effectively orphaned from their own history and heritage, leaving them vulnerable to whatever new identities and belief systems the controlling powers wished to install. The religious dimension of the collapse occupied perhaps the most central place in Elder Ephraim's prophetic vision, not because he believed authentic faith would disappear entirely, but because he foresaw a proliferation of false spiritualities and corrupted religious forms that would deceive even those who considered themselves believers and spiritual seekers. He spoke of a great deception that would sweep through religious institutions themselves, compromising them from within through leaders who would prioritize political relevance and social acceptance over fidelity to transcendent truth, leaders who would gradually reshape religious teaching to conform to cultural preferences, rather than calling cultures to conform to divine requirements. This internal corruption of religious institutions represented, in his understanding, a far greater threat than external persecution, because persecution strengthens authentic faith while corruption destroys it from within, replacing genuine spiritual life with comfortable counterfeits that maintained religious appearance while abandoning religious substance. The elder warned specifically about the rise of spiritualities that promised enlightenment without repentance, peace without transformation, and unity without truth, attractive but poisonous substitutes that would draw millions into spiritual death while providing them with the comforting illusion that they were actually progressing toward spiritual life and awakening. Throughout this detailed mapping of collapse, Elder Ephraim consistently emphasized that these mechanisms were not operating independently, but as coordinated elements of a single strategic design, components of the unseen war that was being waged against humanity itself, by forces that operated in spiritual dimensions, beyond normal human perception, but with effects that would eventually become undeniable in the material realm. He insisted that recognizing this coordination was essential for understanding what was actually happening in the world, because viewing these various trends as isolated developments or unfortunate accidents prevented people from grasping the overall pattern and therefore from mounting any effective response or resistance. The elder's teaching on this point was urgent and insistent. The war was already underway, the battle was already joined, and those who failed to recognize this reality were already casualties whether they knew it or not. Their apparent comfort and normality merely temporary conditions that would evaporate when the unseen war finally manifested in forms too obvious to deny or ignore, by which time the capacity for effective response would have been systematically dismantled through all the mechanisms he had been describing with such careful precision and prophetic clarity. The specific signs that Elder Ephraim identified as markers of the approaching final conflict were not presented as abstract symbols requiring elaborate interpretation, but as concrete phenomena that careful observers would recognize in their own experience and in the events unfolding around them in real time, indicators designed to provide warning and opportunity for spiritual preparation, to those who maintained the vigilance and clarity necessary to read them correctly. He spoke first of the acceleration that would characterize the final period, not merely subjective perception of time passing more quickly, but an actual compression of historical development, where changes that previously required generations would occur within years or even months, as if history itself was being forced through a narrowing funnel toward some inevitable convergence point. This acceleration would manifest across multiple domains simultaneously: technological change, cultural transformation, political upheaval, environmental disruption, creating a disorienting sense that the familiar world was dissolving beneath everyone's feet, while something entirely new and unprecedented was being born through the chaos and dissolution. The elder emphasized that this acceleration was itself a sign, an indicator that the processes he had described were entering their final and most intensive phase, when the hidden architecture of the unseen war would begin manifesting with increasing obviousness in the material realm. Natural disturbances represented another category of signs in Elder Ephraim's prophetic framework, though he was careful to distinguish his understanding from either scientific naturalism that viewed such events as random physical phenomena or superstitious fatalism that saw every earthquake or storm as direct divine judgment, requiring no further interpretation or understanding. Instead, he described natural disruptions as responses of creation itself to the spiritual condition of humanity, a kind of cosmic feedback mechanism, where the violations of moral and spiritual law produced corresponding disturbances in the natural order, not through mechanical cause and effect, but through the deep interconnection between spiritual and material reality that modern consciousness had largely forgotten or denied. He spoke of earthquakes increasing in frequency and intensity, of weather patterns becoming erratic and destructive, of the earth itself becoming unstable, in ways that would defy easy scientific explanation because the root causes were spiritual rather than merely geological or meteorological. These natural signs, he insisted, were meant to awaken humanity to the gravity of its spiritual condition, to provide visceral evidence that something fundamental was wrong, that the order within which life had comfortably proceeded for so long was beginning to fail and collapse under the weight of accumulated violations and corruptions. The rise of the new global power would become increasingly obvious as one of the most significant signs marking the approach of final conflict, as the entity or system that had been operating beneath the surface of conventional geopolitics would begin to reveal itself more openly and assert its agenda with decreasing subtlety and increasing force. Elder Ephraim described how this power would present itself as humanity's savior from the very chaos and crises that its own hidden operations had largely created, offering solutions that required the surrender of freedom and authentic identity in exchange for promises of peace, security, and unity that would never actually be delivered, but would serve as effective tools for consolidating control over populations desperate for stability and order. He spoke of technologies that would be introduced ostensibly to solve practical problems, but would simultaneously establish comprehensive monitoring and control systems, of economic arrangements that would be presented as necessary responses to financial crises, but would effectively eliminate economic independence and create total dependency on centralized systems, of political structures that would be justified through appeals to global cooperation and unity, but would actually represent the construction of totalitarian governance on an unprecedented scale. The elder's warnings on this dimension were particularly urgent because he foresaw how attractive and reasonable this new power's promises would appear to populations that had been sufficiently frightened and destabilized by the various crises and disruptions characterizing the transitional period. The spiritual dimension of the signs Elder Ephraim described included phenomena that would be invisible to those operating entirely within materialist frameworks, but unmistakable to those who maintained active spiritual awareness and discernment. He spoke of an increasing heaviness in the spiritual atmosphere itself, a growing sense of oppression and darkness that sensitive individuals would feel pressing down upon them with increasing weight as the final period approached, not as psychological depression or personal neurosis, but as accurate perception of objective spiritual conditions that were deteriorating toward critical thresholds. He described how authentic spiritual life would become increasingly difficult to maintain, how prayer would require greater effort, how clarity would be harder to achieve, how the spiritual gifts and graces that had previously been accessible with relative ease would require intense struggle and perseverance to attain and sustain. This increasing difficulty, he explained, was itself a sign, not an indication that spiritual reality was becoming less real or less powerful, but rather evidence that opposing forces were intensifying their assault on human consciousness and spiritual capacity, attempting to close off access to the sources of truth and strength that would enable resistance to the deceptions and controls being systematically deployed. Political and social fragmentation represented another category of signs in Elder Ephraim's prophetic vision, polarization reaching levels that would make previous partisan divisions appear mild and manageable by comparison, as societies would split along multiple fault lines simultaneously: ideological, economic, cultural, generational, with each division reinforcing and intensifying the others in self-amplifying cycles of conflict and animosity. He described how this fragmentation would be both organic, emerging naturally from the spiritual and moral collapse he had mapped in such detail, and deliberately fostered by forces seeking to prevent unified resistance to their agenda by keeping populations locked in internal conflicts that consumed their attention and energy, while preventing them from recognizing the larger patterns and coordinated operations occurring above and beyond their localized struggles. The elder specifically warned about the weaponization of identity itself, how people would be trained to define themselves primarily through their grievances and differences rather than through shared humanity or common spiritual identity, creating conditions where dialogue became impossible, where every disagreement became existential conflict, and where the basic social cohesion necessary for functional civilization would dissolve into hostile factions capable only of mutual destruction rather than any constructive resolution or reconciliation. The final devastating conflict that Elder Ephraim foresaw would emerge, according to his prophetic testimony, not as isolated military confrontation between traditional nation-states, but as comprehensive collapse affecting every dimension of human civilization simultaneously, economic systems failing, political structures dissolving, social order breaking down, natural disasters multiplying, all occurring within a compressed time frame that would overwhelm humanity's capacity to respond effectively or maintain any semblance of normalcy or control. He described this final phase as the full manifestation in material reality of the unseen war that had been waging in spiritual dimensions throughout the entire period of preparation and signs, the moment when the hidden operations and accumulated consequences of countless spiritual violations would suddenly erupt into visible catastrophe that no one could deny or explain away through conventional frameworks. The elder emphasized that this conflict would be unlike anything in recorded history, precisely because it would not be merely political or military, but fundamentally spiritual. A clash between incompatible visions of reality itself, between those who had maintained connection to transcendent truth and those who had fully embraced the deceptions and illusions that the new global power had been systematically installing in human consciousness throughout the preceding period. His final message on this point was simultaneously terrifying and hope-filled. The conflict would be devastating beyond imagination for those who had refused all warnings and rejected all opportunities for spiritual preparation. But it would also represent liberation and vindication for those who had endured the increasingly difficult task of maintaining authentic spiritual life and resisting comprehensive cultural programming towards spiritual death and bondage disguised as enlightenment and progress.